Hello to my video on the Graupner phases as applied to the MZ-32 and MZ-16. I believe that some of the theory I'm going to discuss with you and the things I show you would be applicable to the MZ-24. Just note that the menus there are somewhat different. So what is a phase? Unlike dual rates or any of the other features we have that you apply to one single switch to control one single output, a phase can be applied to everything. So it can operate and change how any of the switches work, how any of the functions work, how any of the mixes work. So by flipping one switch, you can make the radio work completely different. And it's a very powerful thing, but also something that you have to keep in mind as you do things. And we'll talk a little bit about that more as I go on. With great power comes great responsibility. But I think this is something that you should use straight off the bat. Don't think, oh, phase is complicated, we're not going to do it, because I don't know what it does. I'm going to try and show you how simple it is to do it. I'm not going to do very complicated things, because I don't think that's the point here. This is more of an introduction on how to use phases. Alright, so let's get started here. I'm going to create a simple model. And to create models, as you all know, is you just go and click on a model, the plus, and we'll just call this phase. Very simple, right? Okay, and for giggles, I am going to select two flaps, just because I'm not going to really use it during this video, but there it is. Anyway, so as this is all going to be about phases, I'm going to start with setting up phases, and I'm just going to set up two phases. To get to phases, we go to menu, function, and in the top of the function menu you should see phase set. By default there is a normal phase defined. You cannot delete it. It is there. To add one, just like adding a model, click on the number, click on plus. By default, you have a number of things in there, and they kind of focused on I'm not sure. If I go by this cell planes, I'm not gonna go into cell planes versus planks here. I'm just trying to show some phases. So since I'm gonna do low rates, high rates, I don't have a default here. What I do is I click on the dash dash dash, and I now have a new phase. I can now name that phase by clicking on the dash 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 under phase edit, click on the pencil and name it low rates. All right. I repeat this to add a second phase, which we will call high rates. Duh. Oops. Let's hit the right button. All right. So now that I have the two phases defined, that doesn't mean anything because they're not controlled yet, they're not activated or whatever. To set up the phases, we need to assign a switch to it. So we click on the control column there, and then go and operate the switch that you'd like to use for your phases. In this case, I only have the two phases, so I'm going to use a 2-position switch. I'm going to use switch 8, and I actually want switch 8 to be in that position when it's on. So okay, and then we click on the control for high rates and operate that same switch to the second position, and now I have low rates, high rates defined. Of course, you can go and assign voices to it. It is not part of what I'm doing here. I'll probably do something on voices in another video shortly. But yeah, you will want to set that up as well so we can talk to you. Anyway, now that we have phases defined, we want to do a couple of things. So what is low rates and high rates about? It's all about controlling your control surfaces, right? And so for those, we are going to go back to the base menu and go into dual rates Expo, right? By default, all of these controls are global. And with global, I mean that it will operate, doesn't matter what phase you have selected. That I think we want to change right off the bat. And the way that you make a control or a mix or anything phase dependent as opposed to global is you click on the globe. When I tap that globe icon, it now changes to phase. And to show you how this works, let's make a quick change here. Since I'm in low rates, I'm going to say, let's change the travel here, and I'm going to link my full negative and positive items here so I can exchange them both together, and we'll make that 80. And so now on low rates, my aileron, and if I go here to my servo view, you'll see what I mean. If I operate my aileron full deflection, I get 80. And that's what that did for me. All right, so if we go back, now if I switch back to high rate, you'll see that I have 100. And that's as easy as that. Now we have phase control over aileron there. You can do the same thing for elevator or rudder. To link them, I'm not going to go into detail that to save time. The next thing we want to do, obviously, is we actually want to go and set some Expo up on it. Maybe you don't need a lot of Expo in low rate since you've just changed the amount of movement you have, or you do. I prefer Expo to use it, especially on high rates. I put a bit of Expo on there, but even on low rates, I think it's a very valuable something to have in here. And so how do we manage that? We want to change low and high rate. So let me select this quick tip. If you want to get these values for the Expo selected, you can tap, of course, on the Expo, but also moving the stick and moving the yellow line to one of your dots would give you that. And in this case, I want to adjust both positive and negative Expo the same value. Now I don't have a slider here. I do, however, have this little yellow bar on the left side. Note that positive Expo makes control around the center softer, while negative Expo make it a lot more sensitive or twitchy, if you like. So to explain that, if you see the yellow line, as I move my stick here left and right, the movement that you get for a little movement, you're a lot of travel for the servo there, and that's not typically what you want. You want to go positive. Ooh, how did I manage that now? Huh. That is weird. Okay, let's do a reset on those. I'm not sure exactly, twiggling too much there. And that is why. So apparently I'm not allowed to mess with aileron movement while I'm setting my Expo. So quickly, let's set the Expo here to -44, which gives me quite a bit of Expo. It'll soften the movement quite a bit on my low rates. If I hit high rates, I can now do the same thing, but obviously I don't want as much, so I'm just going to go here and say, yeah, 26 is good enough, just to give me a little bit of a softer feel around the center. But anyway, so that's gives me high rates there. As I mentioned, you can do the same thing, if I can get that to work, for elevator and rudder, and you probably want to. You can also note that if, say for rudder, you don't want it to be phase dependent, leave it global. But you can still assign a switch to it. And the way you do that is you go to QREX here, and you can say, okay, if I want to change this, let's say we use switch 7 here, and now switch 7 allows me to go into this mode, and if we click on 3 there, we go to the next position. And now, independently for these, I can go and change the value for the rudder to be, and I just link this, and I can set, using switch 7 now, to operate this independently. And note that applies to the rate as well, right? So I can actually say, change my rate for this to something a little, so on. Wow. I was just saying it's not phase dependent, but there we go. So you can actually change the values to be whatever you want in by using a switch. So I've just used a switch, assigned a switch, change the values for the router completely independent of the phases. As you can see, I flipped the phases and there's no impact at all on that. Now that we have our dual rates defined and set up, we're going to go back. Come on. And play a little bit with flaps. And this is to show you a little bit more power of what phases bring to the table for you, and maybe a little trick or two along the line as well. So if we go to flaps, you'll see that my two flaps are set up globally. Note that flap 2 is linked to flap 1, so I only need to operate things for flap 1 to affect flap 2. The first thing that we want to do is set a switch to operate the flaps. In this case, I'm just going to use switch 5 over here. I'm going to reverse that. And so now, if you go and look at your servo view, you have flaps, and both flaps 1 and 2 is operating on that one switch. There's a interesting thing here, if you didn't know, two tips actually that I can quickly give you. One is, if you tap on the screen, note that it changes to show you the pulse output, which is something that you might be interested in if you set up for instance a quad and you want to see what your sticks look like. You can come here and take a look at it, and tapping on that again switches to the visual view or percentage view if you like. Just one tip. The other one is, if you hit this view button over here, it switches you back to where you came from originally. So you don't have to go and navigate through the menus to get to things. Or if you're in here thinking you need to hit the main menu button to go to and then get back to you were, just hit this button and it'll switch you from view back to the last menu that you were in. Just a quick tip there. Okay. So now we have flaps defined on a switch. There's one thing though, I really like to have my flaps phase dependent, because, well, I might want this delay set up differently between high rates and low rates. So now that it's global here, I can have these values defined, and my delay is in there, but there's no effect between them when I switch between high rates and low rates. So to change that, we tap the globe icon, and now my flaps are phase dependent. Notice that as soon as I did that, it wiped out all my settings there, because it says by default, well, if you're going to use phases, maybe you want something else to control that or have an impact on it. And that is true to some degree or another, but it's debatable to some point. So for high rates here, I'm going to actually set up, if I can make this thing move on it. Okay, let's not worry about that. Apparently I can't make it move with a pen. So these are just examples, by the way, guys. Don't use this to set up your plane. The values that I'm putting in is for illustration purposes only, and shouldn't be used. Again, I need to go and set up my switch. So I'm going to flip my switch here. And you see I reverse it. And the reason for that is, if you go to my view here, I like when my switches are all the way from me for that value to be one way. And then when I pull it all the way to me, that's my flaps all the way down, full flaps down if you like. Just way it is. Maybe your model is different, you don't need to change it. it's just the way that you set up the plane. It doesn't mean anything specifically here. It's just a way that I set it up my last model. So don't worry about the reverse switching thing unless you need to have your switch operate in a different direction for your model. Next point I wanted to make here is say, okay, we're in high rates and I set those high rates. When I move to low rates, notice that again, I don't have a switch here or delays, which means that I can either choose in low rates not to operate flaps. I'm not sure why you wouldn't want to do that on a switch, and I can change my delays again. So since I am gonna use switch, I hit the globe icon, that's terrible. At least I remembered what I did there. We operate switch 5. Remember to keep it the same between low rates and high rates. You don't want this thing to reverse on you, because that could be disastrous. Your switch direction should always be the same. And then for delays on low rates, let me try this again and see if this works for me. Haha. Okay. So I can do that and that. All right. Now, so between high rates and low rates, I have completely different values for my flaps, which shows you one power of phases, something that's important. Now, you could have done that to some degree with switches as well. I prefer to use everything on phases I can, and there's a big reason. And maybe a quick side here, guys, that I just thought of as I'm going through this. I can set delays here on the function, right? And I can set delays on the servo set. The reason I don't advise doing a delay here on servo set is that it applies to the servo only at that point in time. Now, it could be that when you do this thing up, for some reason, your left and right servo don't match up quite fine. There's ways and means that you can deal with that. And I think that might be another video I can go into, but you have the way to balance servos when you go in there. There's a balancer and you can actually match travel between two servos and go in that, but I'm not going to go into detail with us. But when the point I'm trying to make here is when you use the delay here, it only applies to the servo. When you go and use delay in control set, why did I go to Expo? When you go to control set, this applies to the function. So delay here now applies to, and this is again interesting, guys, if I bear with me as I switch here, notice that delay is on both my flaps, even though I didn't set anything on channel 7. Remember, channel 6 is my master, and so it controls, and you don't have to set anything in there. Again, another reason to use the function here in control set, not the servo itself. Just an FYI. Okay, so now I can go in and I can say at low rates, I don't want my flaps to travel all this much, right? So what does that mean? We go to value. I can say for my Y values, and notice I just flipped the switch there to so it selects my my items. I'm going to link them again because I want them to travel at the same time. I use my bar here to say this is the amount of travel on low rates I want, and then you can go to high rates, and again you can change that to some other value that you want. So now between low rates and high rates, my flaps have different travel, and it's a very desirable feature, I believe. So that covers setting up the flaps basics, right? Now there's another thing that you could do with flaps that is really, really interesting, and I think something that you guys might be interested in to apply as you test and first set up your, as you might not know how much this needs to be, and you want to tweak your flaps again. And the way that you may want to do that is either through changing your X and Y values or the offset. And I'm just going to pick offset here because it's something I used just recently. And you're saying, okay, while I'm flying, how am I changing this offset? I don't want to look at my radio and doing it. Well, you don't have to. What I can do is I can actually assign a control to my offset value. And the way to do it is, you see this little red arrow triangle down here in the bottom. If I tap that, I now get a direct adjust item, and I can assign a control to that. In this case, I want to use a slider because while I'm flying, I can operate my sliders fairly easily and it won't impact me. I don't have to look down at my radio. So now, if I go back to my screen, you'll see that my offset moves my slider moves my offset completely for me. Really, really helpful when you're trying to find out how much flap you need while you're flying, and you can come back and you can look at your values and you know where your slider is at, and then apply that manually to that and turn off the direct control. I wouldn't advise leaving it all the time. Maybe you want to, I don't know, it's up to you. But that is a really nice feature to be aware of as you set up your plane the first time. All right, so we've set up our flaps. Obviously, if you use flaps, or maybe not obviously, but if you use flaps, there is interaction, right? Your plane, when you activate flaps, your plane is gonna tilt up or down, depending on which the plane you have. And you want to counter that with some elevator. So the next thing you want to do is go into functions, go to wing tail, select your flap to elevator. So I'm operating my flaps and it'll have an effect to my elevator. Since this is going to be a phase dependent item, I'm not going to assign a control to it. I am just going to activate it. So I'm clicking on that activate icon, and now that phase or this mix is active for my flap to elevator mix. To make adjustments to it, you click on the picture, and this allows you to set some to set some values in here. So how much elevator do you want to have applied for that switch? When you throw your flap switch, how much elevator do you want applied? Note that at the moment it is global again, but since you have your flaps set to be phase dependent and travel is, I would advise making the mix phase dependent as well. This will allow you to have a different rate set for, and so I'm just going to say for low rates we have 3 in there, and if I go to high rates we're going to have 2. And so now, because of phase dependency, I have values there. Actually, I'm going to put some higher numbers in here because 3 is not going to be very visible, and for that I'm just going to use a slider. I just want to show you the impact. I just caught myself up with this thing again, guys. Remember when I said things get reset when you switch between global and phases? Well, I forgot to hit the activate button again, so hit the action button and reset that. Now if I go back, and again, see, that's why I use Silverview all the time. When you do things, come and validate it right away, so you don't have to go, oh, what just changed? Okay. So now as I flip my flaps down, you'll see that I have elevator mix come in, and note that that elevator mix also comes in slow. It is timed with my flaps, so it doesn't just snap into position, and that's because of the way that we set this all up and use the functions instead of just switches to control things. So now that we have flap set up and we have our elevator mix up set up, maybe again, just like we did for flaps, maybe you don't know what this value is going to be. What do I need it to be? I mean, 30 obviously is not the right value. So maybe we need to assign it to a control as well. And the reason I want to show is just that you don't have to use one of the sliders on the side. You can use a knob. So in this case, I'm just going to turn DV1 here, and now I have DV1 assigned to rate B. Note that it tells you under the name there what control it's actually assigned to, or not control, but what value adjust you're assigned to. So now you also have the little red triangle in the top there telling you this is assigned to a direct control. So if I operate DV1, you can now see that my value here goes up and down. And you really don't want to move that too rapidly while flying. You want to use one click at a time, because you don't want to porpoise up and down as you swing that knob left and right. Just another little tip. All right, so I think this covers the use of phases and a few other little tips and tricks as I went into it. If you want more detail, please leave some comments down below, and I'll get back to you. If you have a specific problem that you just cannot solve, you can find me in RC groups as UFASA, or just comment here and I'll see if I can make you a video specifically for the problem that you have, and we can try and solve the issue. All right, appreciate you watching. Comment, like, subscribe. Appreciate it, guys. Talk to you next time.